Hello. Today I'd like to talk about our nervous system and why it appears to me that it is the only truth and way forward in the traumatized world that we live in. So, why do I believe this? Well, where are we at the moment in our human condition? There is a very fragile veil of certainty stretched thin over the vast unknown that underlies everything we do. We are born into existence, thrown into a reality we did not choose. We wake up each morning, fill our days with activity, then rest, only to repeat this cycle until one day we cease. We stop functioning, we disintegrate, and we perish. Yet somewhere along the way, amidst the mystery of this fleeting existence, we began to ask the deepest questions. Why are we here? Why do we exist? How should we live? What makes life worth living? And what comes after death? These questions have echoed through generations of human experience, inspiring countless answers. But strangely, many of these answers are held not just as perspectives, but as absolute truths, doctrines to live by, claimed to accurately reflect reality itself. This is true across all domains of knowledge: religion, spirituality, philosophy, psychology, even science. Each offers a framework, a story about how things are and how we ought to be, yet none can claim ultimate, unquestionable truth. Every system relies on some form of faith. Faith in our senses, faith in reason, faith in the physical world, or faith in something beyond it. Even the most rigorous scientist must trust that reason and logic themselves truly map the world as it is. But when we look closely, a troubling pattern emerges. Every claim about ultimate reality eventually, upon inspection, dissolves into skepticism, circular reasoning, or just emptiness, an inability to find some inherent and final essence that makes it true. There is no final why or how that can be pointed to with absolute certainty. It seems that ultimate explanations of meaning or purpose lie beyond the human reach and what our cognitive tools allow us. This is not a failure of our intelligence, nor is it a failure of the biological system that encompasses us. It is more a recognition of our nature as biological organisms with nervous systems that evolved primarily for survival, not for an understanding of truth. Our perceptions are bounded by our biology, shaped by language, culture, and the stories that we tell ourselves. Our senses and our minds have limits. The truth, if it exists, may simply be beyond them because as it appears to us at the moment, we have not developed to discover the truth. So where do we go from here? I haven't found a definitive why or how, and I doubt that anyone can honestly claim to have found one. While we can ask what life is ultimately for, the answers offered are all built on uncertain foundations. And the differences between them ultimately seem quite arbitrary. Their differences are based on differences in values. No one answer is inherently better than another in any way, only more or less convincing depending on who one is and where they find themselves in space and time on planet Earth. What we believe, value, and strive for emerges from culture, language, and personal history, none of which are inherently right or wrong. We have limited control over what moves us, what feels meaningful, what feels convincing, or why we believe what we believe. Across centuries and societies, the variety of beliefs and practices reflect diverse human attempts to respond to the fundamental challenges of existence. And this awareness has led me to shift my focus away from chasing an elusive ultimate truth and instead to seek something more grounded, to understand my own lived experience as a human being. Because when reason reaches its limits and logic can no longer justify itself, what remains is our existence, phenomenology, the here and now, the present moment. So the question that I think is now more important is, how should we as finite, uncertain, and embodied humans live once certainty collapses? When we discover the inherent emptiness and sunyata of things, where do we go from here? If we stop asking questions that our nervous systems were never designed to answer, we are brought back into our lived experience. And lived experience, as neuroscience increasingly makes clear, is grounded in our biology. Human beings are biologically embodied systems. Long before philosophy, morality, or spirituality, we evolved to survive. Our primary mode of contact with reality is not abstract reason, but nervous system regulation, the continuous assessment of threat and safety, the drive for connection, coherence, and stability. Cognition doesn't float freely above the body. It is shaped, constrained, and organized by it. This reframes what it means to know in the world. We are not discovering an objective reality in any direct or final sense. There's no neutral world out there that we progressively uncover. What we're actually learning more about is how the human organism relates to existence. Because all experience, all knowledge is mediated through perception, sensation, affect, language, and story, through the limits and capacities of the nervous system itself. In this sense, we don't discover reality so much as participate in constructing it. The stories we tell ourselves about the world are not optional add-ons. They shape how the world is felt, interpreted, and lived by us. Much of life unfolds before conscious thought. The nervous system processes sensory and relational signals pre-reflectively long before we form beliefs or explanations. As children, we first experience bodily states, comfort, fear, excitement, shame, and only later develop thoughts that attempt to make sense of them. Emotion and regulation appear to precede cognition. The body seeks consistency and safety, prioritizing familiar patterns that once supported survival. So over time, thought begins to mirror these bodily expectations, organizing perception and meaning around what feels known and manageable. When the internal world is dysregulated early in life, the life that follows often reflects this. What we experience as the world is not a fixed truth about how humans function, but a projection of our collective nervous systems. So what we experience as the everyday world around us is not just the way things are because that's the way they are. It is our projection of how we are individually. A projection of our fears, our unmet needs, our coping strategies. Individual lives reflect inner worlds. Societies reflect the individuals that compose them. And if we take seriously the idea that we are, in a way, biological organisms, then we must also ask what kind of environment our nervous systems are currently living inside. And the way it appears to me is that much of modern life works directly against our nervous systems. Productivity cultures reward chronic stress, long hours, and output over effort or sustainability. Education systems prioritize performance and results while neglecting emotional literacy, relational skills, and self-awareness. Children are rarely taught how to regulate emotions, navigate conflict, or repair relationships, and so adults unconsciously pass on the very dysregulation that they inherited to the kids who come after them. Financial systems expose large populations to ongoing insecurity, particularly through housing and debt. Markets encourage transactional relating, reducing people to roles, functions, and consumption patterns. Belief systems, whether religious, philosophical, psychological, or scientific, often confuse control with truth, offering certainty without humility. Ideologies hijack fear and promote safety through rigid answers. And advertising and media continuously stimulate desire and inadequacy, while beauty standards objectify bodies and tether self-worth to appearance and to the size and shape of certain varieties of skin folds that we have on our bodies. When the nervous system is chronically threatened, as it appears to me to be, perception narrows, attention collapses around survival, around me, about being good enough, about fitting in. Our cognitions become rigid, meaning making is distorted, and what emerges is not clarity, but a kind of psychological tunnel vision, a prison cell organized around fear. And dysregulation doesn't remain private, it transmits outward through families, institutions, and cultures. Our biology under pressure reproduces this pressure at greater levels, and this is the impact of projection. The pattern looks something like dysregulated individuals co-regulating one another into families, dysregulated families co-regulating institutions, and dysregulated institutions normalizing dysregulation as reality. Our reality is something that traumatizes and dysregulates us, and it has been described as normal, and people who fit into this system are described as normal. Whereas it seems to me that those who are abnormal are actually having a normal response to an abnormal reality that we are currently inhibiting. So those who we usually consider as abnormal may be the ones having a normal response to how abnormal our world currently is. Somewhere along the way, we lost touch with a basic truth, that we are nervous systems in relationship. We co-regulate. That means that we regulate each other based on our nervous systems interacting, and this happens unconsciously. We are social organisms. We make meaning, and our realities are shaped as much by safety and connection at a biological level as by ideas that we think are true and that we think are beyond biology. Now, from this perspective, a provisional diagnosis emerges, the diagnosis of our current human condition. That it is characterized by chronic nervous system dysregulation, driven by persistent threat activation in environments that mistake control, productivity, and certainty for safety. What we call anxiety, insecurity, and meaninglessness are not personal failures, but adaptive responses to conditions that exceed our biological and relational capacities. The dominant structure of modern life keeps nervous systems locked in survival mode, and survival mode cannot generate wide perception, humility, care, or genuine meaning. Instead, it creates a self-reinforcing loop. Dysregulation gives rise to distorted meaning, which becomes embedded in systems that further perpetuate dysregulation. And being a part of this system means that we are all implicitly contributing to the harm that we are experiencing. And clinically, this would present in a society that is hypervigilant, rigid, that is partial to black and white thinking, has identity defensiveness, ideological certainty, transactional relations, shame-based self-worth, and control masquerading as truth. Now, I can't speak for all cultures across all times, but this description captures with unsettling accuracy the Western society that I inhabit. And it is enough for me to understand to say that in both moral and emotional terms, it is largely not working and it is hurting us. And I want to be clear here about one important point, that I'm not saying that we are just human or that we are just biological creatures or that everything about who we are can be fully explained by the activity of cells and neurons. That would be a reductionist claim. And reductionism is the idea that everything that happens at higher levels of reality is simply and entirely determined by what happens at lower levels. In other words, that the properties of complex systems are nothing more than the sum of their smallest parts. But in my view, this perspective falls short in explaining the richness of human experience. Emergentism offers a different way of understanding. It holds that higher level phenomena like consciousness, identity, or meaning are not merely the mechanical outcomes of cells firing or molecules interacting, but are genuinely new properties that arise from the complex interplay of simpler parts. To use a common analogy, water is made from hydrogen and oxygen atoms, but wetness is an emergent property that can't be found in any single atom alone. The wetness of water is something qualitatively different from hydrogen and oxygen individually. It emerges only when they come together in specific ways. Similarly, the qualities that make us human, our sense of self, our morality, our spirituality, emerge from, but I don't think are reducible to, biology alone. Nevertheless, pure reductionism nor pure emergentism perfectly captures the whole picture. I think they offer complementary lenses for approaching the question of how we know things and why things are as they are. What matters most for us now is that the biology of our nervous system is quite clearly related to our experience of reality. Neuroscience has given us a window into the biological substrate underlying experience, showing us how deeply our minds are rooted in embodied life. Research consistently reveals several key understandings. That emotion and nervous system regulation occur before conscious thought, that our feelings shape the way we experience the world, often beneath our awareness, that our beliefs, values, and stories about the world are deeply influenced and constrained by the state of our bodies and nervous systems, and that these stories that guide who we are and how we live don't float freely in some abstract realm. They are grounded and limited by what our nervous system can hold, tolerate, and integrate. When the nervous system is dysregulated, it clings rigidly to certain stories or patterns, often fear-based or survival-driven, that narrow our perspective. Conversely, a regulated nervous system allows us to hold our stories more lightly, to entertain alternative meanings, and to adapt flexibly to changing circumstances. Now, in this position, I hope that I'm not reducing meaning to neurons firing, because I don't want to dismiss the richness of our lived experience. Rather, I'm trying to situate meaning firmly within embodied life, recognizing that who we are and how we make sense of the world is inseparable from our biology, but isn't limited by it. It's inseparable from our biology, but not limited by it. Meaning, identity, and morality emerge from the dynamic interplay between our nervous systems, our bodies, and the social and symbolic environments we inhabit. We are not simply creatures who respond with fight and flight in every situation. There is a depth and complexity to us that isn't fully accounted for by investigating the biology. So in this way, neuroscience provides us not with a reductive final answer, but with a grounded pragmatic foundation on which we can understand human experience. Not as something disconnected from the physical or just physical, but as something deeply embodied, relational, and emergent, and that this appears to be heavily related to our biology. So at this point, a pattern emerges that becomes impossible to ignore. That chronic nervous system dysregulation, the persistent activation of threat responses, has profound effects on how we experience and navigate the world. It narrows our perception, limiting the scope of what we can see, hear, and understand. Our cognitive and emotional flexibility shrinks, constraining the choices we feel capable of making. Morality itself becomes distorted, often reduced to rigid, black and white thinking or survival-driven justifications. Perhaps most importantly, this dysregulation is not contained within individuals. It ripples outward, spreading harm through the subtle processes of co-regulation, where our nervous systems influence and are influenced by those around us. In contrast, nervous system regulation creates the conditions for expansion and possibility. When our biology feels safe and balanced, perception widens, allowing us to take in nuance, complexity, and multiple perspectives. Our minds become more flexible, able to shift between ideas, emotions, and behaviors with greater ease. The reliability of our meaning-making improves. We can hold our beliefs and narratives lightly, open to revision rather than defensively clinging to them. Most importantly, regulation allows for responses rather than reaction. Instead of being hijacked by automatic threat-driven impulses, we gain the capacity to pause, reflect, and choose actions with intention. From these observations comes a cautious claim, but one that I think is defensible. that regulation itself isn't the ultimate goal. So I'm not putting regulation at the top of some hierarchy that we need to get to. Rather, it's an observation that regulation is a foundational condition that makes any genuine goal possible. Any goal that is freely chosen rather than coerced by fear and threat. So regulation is not the goal, it is a foundational condition that makes genuine goals possible. Because without a regulated nervous system, freedom of choice is largely an illusion, and meaning becomes distorted by survival imperatives. This is why the treatment I would recommend for the diagnosis begins with awareness, a conscious focus on rebuilding and restoring our nervous system's capacity to regulate. Imagine the human experience as a tree. When the roots are rotten and diseased, the tree will produce unhealthy fruit. No amount of polishing or painting can make the fruit truly nourishing or sustain the tree's long-term health. Similarly, much of the popular self-help or self-development culture today, and even our hyperproductivity, is like painting rotten apples red. It masks the underlying damage, offering superficial fixes without addressing the deep trauma and chronic stress that shapes us. Our modern environments and collective histories have left us in a state of deep nervous system dysregulation. This creates fragile foundations for meaning, identity, and morality, the fruit that we live by. Instead of continuing to chase external fixes or ideologies, it serves us better, in my view, to step back and to center ourselves, to attend first to the biology that underpins our experience. Only when the nervous system is calmer and more regulated can we begin to rebuild meaning, values, and connection from a healthier, more grounded place. This approach asks us to shift focus from quick solutions or rigid doctrines towards the slow, patient work of healing. Healing instead of soothing. It calls for environments and relationships that support safety, rest, and play, where we can relearn how to co-regulate and co-create life in ways that nurture flourishing, rather than fear and fragmentation. We need to relearn how to live together and how to value each other with compassion. Nervous systems don't exist in isolation. We are inherently relational beings, and our nervous systems constantly influence and regulate one another through subtle processes, such as co-regulation. This interconnectedness means that the state of one nervous system ripples out, shaping the emotional and physiological environment of others. When individuals have more regulated nervous systems, a cascade of positive effects follow. A more regulated system increases our capacity for genuine choice. It expands the space between stimulus and response, allowing us to act with intention rather than reflexively reacting to perceived threats. It enhances our ability to empathize and attune to others, which are key ingredients for meaningful connection and social harmony. By reducing the grip of fear, regulation diminishes the spread of fear-based ideologies and rigid belief systems that thrive on threat and scarcity. But perhaps most profoundly, in my view, it opens the door for new meanings and new narratives to emerge, meanings that arise without the compulsions of survival imperatives or defensive rigidity, meanings that reflect groundedness and compassion and a care for each other rather than anxiety and insecurity. Practically, this understanding points us toward a few crucial avenues. First, the power of co-regulation through relationships. We need safe, attuned, and compassionate connections because these are the soil in which regulation and healing grow. Secondly, we need practices and interventions that actively reduce chronic threat activation, such as mindfulness, breathing techniques, and somatic therapies, which can restore nervous system balance. Now, these aren't total. These are important. These are part of what make us human, but they don't complete the whole picture. But as it stands, these appear to be how to nourish the soil in which we grow. And thirdly, environments that foster safety, play, rest, and exploration support regulation at this foundational level and allow individuals and communities to flourish. Now, it's important to clarify what this isn't. It's not an endorsement of hedonism or the simplistic injunction to just listen to your body. Hedonism seeks stimulation and often pursues momentary pleasure without regard to long-term well-being. In contrast, nervous system regulation is about restoring agency, our capacity to choose, to pause, to respond with wisdom rather than reacting impulsively. A regulated nervous system does not dictate what we ought to value. Instead, it grants us the freedom to value freely and authentically, whatever that means. Now, the reason that I believe that I have slid into this observation and this belief as a way through emptiness and skepticism is that because a healthier nervous system reliably increases a person's capacity to respond rather than react. It allows one, it's the precondition for one to engage with life, with thought, in a way that is open rather than fearful. And because no nervous system exists in isolation, we necessarily regulate each other, whether we're aware of it or not. And this makes it even more clear why a foundation of compassion and shared care is fundamental for the communities and societies that we live in, rather than the way that it currently is. Improved regulation enhances the reliability of our perceptions and the clarity of our meaning making, allowing us to see and understand with less distortion, and I think in this way necessarily reducing unnecessary suffering. So existentially, I can't claim to know what life should ultimately become, but what I can claim is that I oppose any condition or system that prevents becoming, any force that clamps down on our capacity to grow, connect, and create meaning. In this, nervous system regulation is a fundamental starting point, a foundation for living with resilience and freedom in an uncertain world. If we can approach even dysregulation from a regulated foundation, we can manage a lot more than we think we're capable of, and we can reduce a lot of unnecessary suffering. Now, the position that I offer isn't immune to emptiness or uncertainty. It's provisional, it's contextual, and fundamentally groundless in the metaphysical sense, just like all other positions are. I don't claim some ultimate truth or final explanation, but instead, I am focusing on a phenomenological and pragmatic orientation. This is just one of many starting points that have been provided over the centuries by thinkers. Now, I want to also acknowledge that the most potent critique against my view is that I'm smuggling values into what appears to be a biological fact. So biology alone can't declare that regulation is inherently better than dysregulation. Biology can only observe that different states of the nervous system exist. That is what is happening. There are different states of the nervous system that exist, and I'm smuggling in my own personal value that regulation is better than dysregulation. Now, this is fair enough. History shows us that regulated systems, or those that have appeared to be regulated, have been harnessed to uphold domination, control, and injustice. Meanwhile, dysregulated states have paradoxically sparked prophetic insight, moral revolutions, creative breakthroughs, and spiritual awakenings. Now, my response here is not to offer a metaphysical justification. Instead, I confess that I don't know what life should ultimately become, and I don't say for certain that regulation is always better than dysregulation. But what I observe is that a foundation of dysregulation systematically prevents becoming. It shuts down growth, connection, and possibility. And dysregulation occurring from a foundation of regulation is better than brief stints of regulation occurring from a foundation of dysregulation And I have said the word Asian way too many times, but I hope the point sticks. So regulation then is not this moral absolute or this symbol of purity that we all need to strive towards. It is simply, in my observation, the state that maximizes the psychological capacity to respond rather than react, to revise rather than rigidify, and to relate rather than withdraw. It is a practical precondition for choice and meaning, not a moral imperative in itself. The way I see it is that it is a minimal ethical commitment. There are biases and values which I am smuggling into all of this, which I'm not even aware of. But on reflection, it appears that what is important to me is the desire to reduce unnecessary suffering, to cultivate openness and care, and to hold every story, including my own, with lightness and humility, as well as making life easier for my fellow humans. I can acknowledge that at its heart it is empty and we can be skeptical of it, but it is a choice to engage with life rather than to shy away from it. And I think that it is necessarily human to acknowledge that life must be lived and we must have some kind of belief system that guides us. And perhaps leaning on our biology seems to me to be that which is most honest, most helpful at this point in time for me. So in conclusion, we are finite, embodied relational beings, creatures of flesh, blood, and story. Our nervous systems are the deep, silent currents beneath our experience, shaping how we perceive the world and how we relate to one another. When these systems are chronically dysregulated, suffering follows. Meaning becomes distorted, connection frays, and harm ripples outward between individuals, families, communities, and societies. But when the nervous system finds regulation, something else becomes possible. We move towards flexibility instead of rigidity. We open ourselves to care rather than fear. Creativity flows more freely. And agency, our capacity to choose and to respond rather than react, grows. All in all, it allows our families and our community, our society, our countries to be projections of a more grounded inner state, which hypothetically and theoretically at least would seem to make the world somewhat calmer and more compassionate and one of somewhat less suffering. Certainty about life's ultimate meaning or purpose remains beyond our grasp. We may never have definitive answers, and perhaps that's the nature of being human. Yet despite this uncertainty, and because we must live regardless, this embodied relational place offers, I think, a reasonable and vital starting point. Not a place of rigid answers or fixed doctrines, but a place of conditions. Conditions that allow life to be lived with less fear, more openness, and more possibility. Conditions that invite us to engage with ourselves, each other, and the world from a foundation of safety and presence. This is why that the treatment I'd recommend for the condition of our reality is an awareness and focus on rebuilding our nervous system and allowing our lives to be guided by that. The rotten tree producing rotten fruit cannot be healed by painting the fruit red. Deep down, we live in a deeply traumatized and traumatizing system, and it would serve us well to take a step back, to focus on centering ourselves, and to build back our meanings, our communities, and where we're going from there.